So I once wrote a booklet with a lot of friends called A Bias for Yes, which was the public service thinking about yes, not no, when it came to being challenged by the public. The lawyers, of course, went mad and said you can't be biased, you must not use that word bias. I said it's a cultural thing, it's a way of thinking about it. So you've got to balance that with a clear understanding that you must get it right, because you do nobody any favours if you get it wrong. And you've got to help people get it right as well. If you had to help people by saying this is the right way, if they don't know the right way, they get very confused and lost as well. So getting it right was a very important strategy. Getting it right wasn't even in the winds when it came to the Royal Commission. Starting from it being illegal, but every process was wrong. Nothing was right. Yes. And so that culture of getting it right, I think, just sort of disappeared, really.
Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. My name is Alison Lloyd-Wright, and joining me today on Kaurna land is my fellow South Australian public servant, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
And recovering public servant, now of Good Government Advisory, Danielle Elston.
Hello, Alison.
Now, over the Christmas holidays, you guys had a long sit-down with Sue Varden AO, the inaugural CE of Centrelink, and my first ever CE, for the record.
Oh, I did not know that.
Which is published as a bonus episode. And, Caroline, you were going to follow Sue down one particular rabbit hole, which is the getting it right strategy, which was Centrelink's focus on ensuring people were getting the right payment at the right time. Because you think there's something here to discuss about the balance between the kind of upfront investment in getting things right versus the reactive effort in fixing things up.
Yeah, look, it's interesting because in addition to the conversation with Sue, I also had a conversation over the holidays with someone who had worked at DHS during that period of time, and they offered some really helpful corrections to kind of my pop social analysis of what had been going on. So I think in our early episodes, I had situated the DHS compliance division as unsexy and unpopular, perhaps due to my experience with other compliance divisions, whereas this person really situated compliance as the rainmaker. And while they weren't sexy, they were institutionally powerful, and it was hard for other parts of the business to push back on. And so as part of this conversation, they said, look, there'd always been budget targets associated with compliance, but the thing that this person noted was that as more and more cuts were made to frontline staffing levels, and as there was increased self-service for customers, Centrelink really moved from a culture of getting it right up front to managing via compliance post facto. And so today I really wanted to talk about getting it right up front.
And so what does that look like? Centrelink must make thousands of decisions every day. How hard is it for them to get them right?
I think I could list 100 things that would make it hard, right? We've talked about some of them, the data collection, the transcription errors, the complexity of the legislation. There's some quite passag language in DHS annual reports where they talk about, policy nuance and complexity. But it means that it's quite hard to kind of know exactly a particular person's circumstance. There's obviously people engaging in fraud, whether it's opportunistic or deliberate. And there's a question of resourcing, right? So the ANAO has just put out a very interesting report, if you're as nerdy as I am, about payment accuracy. And what they've said is that resourcing impacts on the timeliness of payments, but it must also impact on the quality, because I think you guys have all worked for a particular person who uses this axiom from consultancy: fast, cheap, quality. You can have 2 but not 3.
Yeah.
Which I still don't believe.
Oh, interesting. I really do.
Be completely
I really
true. So I think there's a certain amount of if you're not doing the getting it right, you're doing a certain amount of giving up along the way. And what you described before around all that complexity, this is also a part of the flipping of the burden, right? So we can't get it right. See if you can. Punter, off you go. We had a stab at it. We think we got a fair few right. Now you can figure out if you were one of the people who we got it right for or not. I'm not prepared to accept that that's the bar.
Oh, that's so interesting, because I was thinking, Danielle, in some of our earlier episodes, you had talked about a bit of a tolerance for when you send out 10,000 letters, you do assume that maybe, 100
A
of them
proportion of them roll.
aren't right. Do you and you've been in businesses where you do send out that kind of much correspondence. Do you have reflections on kind of the risk tolerance and how you set that risk tolerance in an agency?
So I do think it is true if you send out 100,000 letters, it is almost impossible for all of them to be completely correct because of what you've just described. I mean, even just data transcription alone, I'm sure someone's done a study and can tell us that it's X% if people have had to type it in themselves that will never be correct because no one can type everything in correctly. I think when it comes to the risk tolerance part of it, it's a question of what is that risk and articulating it up front, and particularly looking at your customer, the vulnerability of your customer and the impact of what a mistake would mean.
Yeah.
So an impact of a mistake where a mid-range income and we might be $100 out somewhere, and as long as you ring us, we go, oh, sorry, and we refund it.
Yeah.
Probably limited kind of impact on life.
Yeah.
Look, death is a time that where getting your data right's really important, and particularly because you are usually writing the letter to someone who loved someone who died. It might be a partner, a parent, a child, and it's really, really distressing. And so a risk tolerance of sending, so when you collect up birth data, to not, for instance, paying a huge amount of attention to infants who die in stillbirth when we start churning out letters of have you had a vaccination, and I mean those letters from government start with are you enjoying your bundle of joy? That's a soul destroying moment. So I think it's about the impact of what that impact is and what the situation is. It's quite different to a misspelt, if you stay in that kind of births, deaths and marriages space, a misspelt marriage certificate, irritating, but perfectly doable. Quite different to data dumping to a health system or an education system and writing to the parents, for instance, of deceased children. That is something that, for instance, government cannot tolerate.
It should not.
So I think we don't spend enough time articulating how much risk we're prepared to accept.
And on what things.
And what's the impact of them.
And it differs.
Because we just so struggle to say that should never happen.
That's the problem,
and so the thing is, if we articulate a risk tolerance,
we're accepting
that we make mistakes up front, and we're also saying it'll be partly your job to help me fix it, customer. And we are also probably then saying, and we'll make that easy. And so because we can't guarantee that bit either, we don't articulate our risk tolerance because we don't really have good systems to
make it easy.
To fix the mistake.
Fair point. So how should agencies be making choices about how many things they get right, which are the things that they get right?
So, look, I think about it as a bit of a push and pull. Like if I think about how an agency operates, what are the incentives to get it right against the incentives to get it fast or get it done cheaper or whatever, right? And so thinking about the conversation Danielle and I had with Sue, definitely one of the kind of incentives to get it right was the cultural impetus, which she talked about. She talked about a premium placed on getting it right, which is really based in a sense of values. Right? And, so she talked about how important it was to get it right so that people didn't have compliance coming at them, for example. And we hear some of that even in the kind of origin stories of Robodebt. I think I talked to you about that. Like that in their minds, it was a good thing to catch it early so that people didn't get behind. So that's one kind of way. The second one is your contractual arrangements, right? So like DHS was in a contractual arrangement with DSS to deliver this service, and they had to meet certain targets of payment accuracy and payment timeliness and payment correctness, which isn't accuracy. It's just whether Centrelink made a mistake in like literally the handing over of the cash.
Hang on, do it for me again.
So accuracy, payment accuracy, right person getting the right amount of money. Payment timeliness, do you get it on time? Payment correctness, based on the information available to DHS or Centrelink, have they given you the right payment?
So that's not actually accuracy, right?
Well, the ANO makes exactly this point in their recent thing.
Don't want to be a Webster's dictionary about it, but accuracy, I would have thought, meant the person got the right amount of money without the asterisks, based on the available information at the time.
So that is like, I think you've come to the nub of where the incentives are, because here's another telling thing. DSS, in its annual report, reports on payment accuracy, and it sort of goes up and down, but it's about 95%, they say, of payments are made accurately, although the ANAO finds that it's actually about 80%, but anyway. DHS don't report on payment accuracy, they report on payment correctness. So they report on, did we mess up our payment? Not, did we ensure that customers gave us the right information? Because the thing I was talking about, complexity of legislation, right? They're like, well, it's not our fault if DSS make it really hard.
We're also back to quite a lot of hair splitting, and what will happen here is we talk about reporting and we talk about the inability to find patterns, and if we don't all use a common language and a common metric, there's absolutely no chance you're going to find bulk scale mistakes and problems. And so it would just seem to me that we are back to the problem of, if we can't even agree on what good looks like or what getting it right looks like, what chance do we have of it being correct?
Well, and what's really interesting is this ANAO report, on which, you know, I clearly went down the nerd hole, and we'll post into the show notes. They talk about, they can really observe that the internal Centrelink metrics do change the behaviour, right? So the payment timeliness, they look at timeliness and correctness inside Centrelink. And so the payment timeliness, they find that almost every payment is resolved on the first day or on day 41. Why do you think day 41? Because the timeliness KPI was 42. Right?
I was like, a month plus 11 days. What would 41 mean? Yes. Where do you get 41? Right, okay.
Right. And so this is really interesting, because they find really good at getting to that 42, but if you fall out of the 42, those people linger for ages because they've already missed the KPI.
Yeah.
So fascinating. So there are your kind of incentives to get things right. You've got your reporting, you've got your internal metrics. But against those incentives to get things right, you've got need to make savings and free up resourcing for operational priorities. You've got changing operational models. So self-servicing is a classic example.
Yep.
Self-service improves payment correctness on the behalf of Centrelink, because people write in their right details and it means that things go in the right way. But it decreases payment accuracy, because when you're self-serving, you don't necessarily know what you need to declare to make it right for you. And Centrelink just happily ate up that distinction. And then the third thing I think is that there was just no cost to Centrelink to increasingly rely on compliance, because, like, what did it matter?
Well, and compliance was making the money anyway, so...
In fact, the opposite, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a moral cost.
Yeah. Sure.
And the staff wore the moral cost.
And there was a massive cost at the end of the day.
Yes.
There was an army of people.
Cost.
But also there was but even just at a crunchy public sector level, there was an army of people who had to unravel this. There was a Royal Commission. There was we only count what we want to count, and we narrow the field around what is efficiency. And we do it cross-portfolio as well. It's like, I've saved $5 over here by reducing this program, and particularly in social services, that person then, without that service, will pop up and ask for it in another context. So, you know, they'll ask
later and more expensive.
and usually later and more expensively, or if not, bigger systems like health and education, because they are the biggest of the systems, will start to offer the service that a small agency has shrunk itself down to. And the idea is that we haven't, that people looking at it saying, oh, well, the bucket's less. Yeah. No, we just moved it.
Yeah.
So we don't look at efficiency from a end-to-end or a whole person use of the service. We go, which chunk of it, and did we do it more efficiently?
Yeah, so true.
And so one of the things here is around, I guess, the competition between upfront investment versus reactive fix-up, and the pressure that we're under sometimes as public servants to do it now and get it right later.
Never.
So let's talk a bit about this kind of how do you get into the upfront investment right?
Well, look, I've become a little bit obsessed with this, partly because of the UK COVID inquiry. I'll put another link in the show notes, which has been really, like, the first module of that was looking at kind of investment in preparedness, right, which is like a classic kind of upfront money that feels like it's going nowhere. And one of the things that the experts keep saying is that this focus on efficiency, so paring back that upfront investment to as little as possible to free up money for shiny things, left the system much more fragile. And I guess I'd never thought about this trade-off as like efficiency. I've always thought of new public sector management as good, but efficiency does make systems fragile.
Yep.
And redundancy or a little bit of, extra makes them resilient. Do you reckon?
Yeah, I do. I'm just not sure that it's redundancy in some ways because that gives the impression that there's not always more to do. I think what you're describing is getting so tight and small that you can only deliver exactly the kind of tight remit of your program or your portfolio, and there's no wiggle room in that at all. And yet we all know that what happens is there are new ideas, you respond to emerging issues. So it's not redundancy. It's almost like, I don't know, a SWOT capability.
Yeah.
And we got rid of that and said, you don't need that. You can do that from your core operations.
Yeah.
But when you think about it, like, what's your experience pre-COVID of doing business continuity planning, right? So you're running this big bit of the business and some, bless them, but mildly irritating person comes around with a phone book sized folder and says to you, you need to do your business continuity plan.
Yes.
It's up or it needs reviewing. And you just think, I'm doing things that are burning today. What do you mean I have to imagine natural disasters and pandemics and figure out how I would operate? And it's very hard to build that future proofing in. I think it'll be easier for public servants after 3 years of managing in a really whack environment. But before then, it was very hard to prioritise spending lots of your day on imagined future scenarios when your very real, not imagined things were still sitting there for today.
Plus, a lot of those BCPs were redundant in
Yes.
COVID, right? And so I do think there's a risk that you build this kind of latent capacity that is either perceived as sitting there doing nothing while waiting for a thing to do.
Yeah.
Or
Is actually doing that thing.
is actually,
when you're there.
yeah, you just work it out in the moment. No one's BCPs, even to the extent to which the BCPs accommodated a pandemic, it assumed that 50% of your staff weren't available to work. That was the scenario.
Yeah.
Not, they all had to work from home.
Yeah.
Right.
And so everyone just winged it.
Yep.
Right? Some departments set up a spreadsheet and sent people home with their monitors and... Yeah.
But again, if you flip it out of... That's a really good example, and yet one of the things I know that was really challenging was up-to-date contact details when you turn everyone off overnight and then they, for instance, that maybe their remoting in isn't working, but you don't have their personal email or phone number or way to contact them. That's because of reduced administrative and HR capacity where you used to update that stuff and be careful about it, and now it's like, I can just email them at work, they've got a work phone, it's fine. And so even without it being BCP, the reduced capacities we have showed up all over the place because those things that didn't matter suddenly mattered.
Yeah.
And you can't always predict what those things are.
Yeah.
You really can't. And there's something, I'm just groping around for... There's something about how organisations that have run so lean for so long, and I think we've all worked in some of those, they're actually often quite good at a kind of instant reactive crisis, right? They kind of cobble together a thing and make a thing happen.
Yeah.
But it loses, there's something about kind of missing the actual purpose of what you're trying to achieve, or you kind of get through, listening to the COVID inquiry, for example, clearly at an overarching sense, the UK government was quite dysfunctional in some of its decision-making in relation to a pandemic, and in particular in Cabinet Office. And there was, lots of reasons for that that relate to both, to the actual government, the political government, not just the bureaucrats, but also the bureaucrats, right? They've been through austerity, they'd just been through... Brexit, so they'd just been through one of these big emergency, they've kind of thought about it. But they also appeared to have they did not appear to have good policy strategic thinkers, but years of lean work, hard environment meant that they had lost so much talent.
Yeah.
But when you just say
about that,
not strategic advisors, policy advisors, there was a period of time in Australia and in various governments where you didn't want to have a policy officer because they'd be the first thing. So it was all about no one in government should be a non-deliverer. Deliverers are people, they are teachers.
They're on the front line.
They're on the front line. They're frontline workers.
Only frontline.
And you can't cut frontline and whatever else. And so...
Yeah, and so the savings have to be mopped up everywhere else.
Which is usually corporate policy, that type of thing.
Yeah.
And then, so you say, oh, there was no strategic policy advisors. It's like, well, no, because we kind of just made a decision that they didn't want them. That's just waffly, weird government stuff. They're just the people who write things that we don't pay attention to. What I really need is an economist to tell me what lever to pull, and what I really need is something really specific. And so the kind of shift, and I feel there's a little bit of a shift back in the last kind of 3 to 5 years. But the shift before that, for a good 15 years, was to just move away from those roles over and over and over again. So then you had a pipeline when you're talking about leaders. There was no pipeline because the skill of a generalist strategic policy advisor who understands government and how government works was considered a nice to have. And if there's not enough money, I'll take me a specific job over that any day. So there's none left.
I wonder if that's a state government specific phenomenon, because I'm just thinking about we throw a bit of shade in the pod on the Commonwealth sometimes about not having lots of operational, and Sue actually really rightly pushed back on me for saying that. So when I say we, I mean me, just to be clear. But I do, there is something I think interesting in a particularly state government about what you just described that feels exactly right to me, right? Like that we've pulled central strategic policy out of lots of different parts because they are so lean.
Yep. And I mean, I think the difference is that is core business for Commonwealth public servants much more often than it is core business in a delivery part of a state government. Any state government, like if you look at the numbers of people employed, the vast majority will be nurses and teachers and rangers and in Queensland people who fix your electricity poles and that's the vast majority of public servants and you're left with, and so it's also about the dominant culture. So the dominant culture there is delivery, whereas in the Commonwealth, noting Sue's view, and she listed off a lot of operations that I think you and I hadn't thought of.
Yes, it's true.
And yet I'd still say that the balance is quite different, and so the thinky policy part of it is much bigger and therefore it's more accepted.
But the other thing that's interesting here is we don't do this everywhere, right? So you use the terminology before a SWAT team. Do you know where has a SWAT team? Police. Yeah. We literally allow a group of people, they're not working every day. They're working every day. They're not responding
before you write in
to a SWAT style emergency. You know, Caroline was also talking about Defence Force.
Yeah.
Like, we have a Defence Force, notwithstanding that we're not always in a war or defence posture. Like, there are some parts of the public service where we do actually recognise that you need this kind of surge capability, that things could go pear-shaped, and when they do, you need people who are really good at letting them go pear-shaped. A SWAT team, what do we call those ones in the army?
The Rangers? I don't know. I've got
no.
You've defeated my military knowledge. Damn it.
No, the special ones.
Oh, special forces?
Yeah.
You got
those
there on your own.
But again, similarly, like special forces, like SWAT team, aren't just your regular...
Yeah.
And yet, to counter that, every time governments have set up internal consultancies, which is supposed to be in some version of a surge capacity, strategic thinkers, bit of this, bit of that, bit of economics. It's a team of people who are supposed to be able to look at a thing and do what you're talking about. Never seems to kind of work the way...
Yeah.
You know, like all Westminster governments do it. It's a cycle thing. They set them up in central agencies or elsewhere. I think the Commonwealth is currently doing it again.
Yeah, there's a live experiment at the moment.
And I always think it's an excellent idea, and yet it never seems to kind of... Like the UK just closed theirs down.
Austerity, though.
No, but they just closed theirs down. I take your point. Like, if we can have one in the army, why can't we have one for policy? And yet when we have them, it doesn't seem to kind of do what is on the box.
I think, I love this bit of the conversation because it's very relevant to the things that I kind of do on a daily basis. But I was also thinking about like teachers and doctors and nurses, right? Like in those organisations, we run things so lean that there is no redundancy for them. Like a mate of mine, she's an ED doctor, and like that there is no moment where you're not being an ED doctor. And I don't think 20 years ago that it was like that, right? Like I think you used to be able to go to the toilet in your shift or something.
Yeah.
And I just think there's something for me about this kind of mantra of efficiency and thinking about how to make things efficient. To your point, Danielle, before, it's efficient in the moment, but over the life cycle of a health system,
it's not.
If you've just burned out all of your doctors, that's not efficient.
No. And so this is my problem because I rate efficiency.
I know.
I colour code my own personal everything, blah, blah, blah. I like to be able to put my hands on information and do everything with the shortest amount of time possible. So I cannot advocate inefficiency, which is the opposite. I don't think it is about being less efficient. I think it's that we're just choosing to look at one bit. I really do. So I think we're actually being really, really inefficient whilst we think we're being fast and lean. And I think
I think we're misdefining efficiency.
Yes. Okay.
Actually.
So this is where we're
So I think we're actually really inefficient a lot of the time. I would argue that Robodebt shows that was the least efficient way to pay people.
So inefficient.
Again, leaving aside human toll.
Yeah.
If we just stick with like non-person metrics, cost a fortune, took forever,
and we're still picking through it and they're still trying to...
crashed the place.
Yeah.
How could you possibly argue that was efficient? And so this is the saving the money up front and then spending it all at the end.
Yeah.
Because, and some of that's the old get it up and out as quickly as possible so that we've achieved it. That's fine. But it's not just that. It's that we're only choosing to look at one piece of it. And I mean, even to be honest, if you wanted to look at efficiency, we're going to do compliance and we're going to cut people's payments, etc., and penalise. Are you telling me that doesn't show up in a Commonwealth or state-funded homeless and housing program, food program? Yeah. So if you looked at the life cycle of that one decision, no matter how quickly your computer system turned that payment off and how much you could get a tick for how quickly they did that, even if it was accurate, right?
Yeah.
Was it cost-effective? Was it efficient? Was it... And most of these decisions are turning out not to be. We're not really saving money.
And you have said before, Alison, when we've talked about the Westminster silos and kind of your lines of accountability up, I mean, I do think this is one of the things that's increasingly clear is that those efficiencies are felt in other silos. So as a good public servant, is it my responsibility to point out all the different ways in which my decision and my efficiency here impacts other agencies? I mean, I think it is, and I always try to raise those things, but it's quite hard to actually find the institutional mechanisms where you have those conversations. Like, where do you do that?
I mean, call me crazy, but isn't that what central agencies are for?
And the cabinet table.
Yeah, cabinet table's too senior, right? Like, I'm talking about, like, when I don't know, change an allied health service provision in an education setting, for example, and that either reduces load on the health system or increases load on the health system, depending on which way you change it. Like, what are our obligations as public servants to go and do?
So my view is whole of government because it goes back. See, this goes back to me for the customer. Like, you're a customer of Centrelink, but you're also a customer of health. And so real people don't think we're all different things. Real normal people think that when they are interacting with government that there is some kind of connection between the ideas. I know. And I think it's an expectation that they should continue to put pressure on us to deliver. And so I think it's right that it's a lower level. I don't think it is all at the cabinet table because I think it's sometimes it's quite operational. And sometimes you see it work really well where in local communities where you have one bit of government and you'll have police working with schools, working with health, working with child protection, and they'll be able to wrap around communities for really good outcomes. And then you go up a level institutionally and it's just not there.
Any other final thoughts on getting it right at the beginning?
Oh, see, I just find Danielle's message there so depressing that I do just want to say, that
not
I know
universally.
you guys and that I have and am involved in work with really good people at the moment who are trying to get past this exact thing. And I just want to I think there's work for us to do about why it's hard, because no one actually thinks it's a good idea to stay in your silo and to push costs to other part of the business, and yet somehow it is a thing that kind of keeps happening. So I feel like there's more to unpick in that one maybe.
My final thought is to spend more time articulating risk and determining how much efficiency you're looking at. Are you looking at the full picture or are you just picking one measure that's suddenly cheaper or faster whilst pushing costs and resources elsewhere?
Till next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. Those of us in the employ of the state government speak in a strictly personal capacity, consistent with the Public Sector Code of Ethics that permits public servants to promote an outcome in relation to an issue of public interest, in this case, the betterment of the public service. Nothing we say should be taken as representing the views of the government or our employers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.